Hey everyone. There's a few more minutes to join, but while we wait, I can answer a few of the questions that were submitted during registration. So the first one someone submitted, they said they're learning Python. Is learning Python enough to be able to write formulas in Grist? In other words, how should my mindset be when it comes to integrating Python knowledge with Grist? So Grist formulas support most Excel functions as well as the Python programming language. So the entire Python standard library is available to you. And honestly, with a basic understanding of Python, you can do a lot of really cool things in Grist. In our webinars, typically we end up going through some formulas. Today we won't. But if you go back through some of the older webinars that are on our YouTube channel, you would see a lot of cool examples. We do have two Grist functions that are particularly helpful in pulling data from other tables, and that's the lookup one and lookup records function. So let me share a link to a helpful article. It's the references and lookups article in our help center. So with an understanding of these functions along with Python, you can do anything really. And if there's something you're trying to do, but you're not quite sure how to do it and you're just kind of getting stuck, just feel free to post in our community forum and we'll be able to help you out. And that goes for anyone. If you don't know Python and you're like, oh, I'm trying to do this, let us know, post in our forum and we can get the formula for you. So I'll share a link to the forum now. And then just another quick item you can take a look at in our help center is the formula cheat sheet. In our help center, you can just do a search for formula cheat sheet, and that has a ton of examples of different formulas you can use and how these are all examples that someone has requested a formula for something, and so I saved the note and created a brief example. And so you can just browse through there if you're kind of curious of the cool things you can do with Grist. Just check out the formula cheat sheet. And then our second question is about the calendar that we'll be looking at today. And it's, can you connect this calendar to Google or Calendly? Not yet, but it is something we want to do. So keep an eye out. Whenever we release anything, it's always in the newsletter. So keep an eye out for that. Though the one thing to note on it is that it would be a one-way sync. So you create a calendar event in Grist, like we're going to see today, and it would send to the other calendar. If you wanted something to send from an outside calendar into Grist, that would require an integration. Like you can use Zapier, Pabbly Connect, one of those integrator services, and then you can send things from outside of Grist into Grist. Okay, well, we will get started. So hello, everyone. Welcome to our October webinar. Last month, we deconstructed the payroll template, which covers common structural patterns, formulas, and dynamic dashboards. And you can find a recording of that webinar along with all of our previous webinars on our YouTube channel. There is a dedicated playlist there for Build with Grist webinars. And you'll find a recording of this webinar there in the near future as well. So you can always go back and reference it. And because you are registered for the webinar, you'll receive an email with the recording as well. So our next few webinars are going to be all about views. Today, we're going to be learning about calendar and card widgets. These are two of my favorite widgets for viewing data. And for an example of this in action, you can check out our travel planning template. I can share a link to that. And we're actually going to use a subset of this same data to walk through the steps of adding the calendar widget and card widget. So just to start, we'll take a look at that template just to see how it all works once the data is entered. So in our travel planning template here, we have several trips with different activities planned. So we can see the events listed here in the calendar, a lot going on. And we can double click on these for more information like their start and end time. But we also have this card widget over here that's linked to the calendar, so we can see event details there as well. So if I click on Bishop Museum, this card in the lower left updates, and I can go to the website. I can see the cost, their address, start and end time are there, and any notes, just extra information. And so this is what we're looking to build out today. Okay, so to start, we'll want to enter our data into a table and then add additional views of this data in a calendar and card widget. So you might not use the table later on to enter details, but to start, you'll want to set up columns. And with our calendar widget, there are a couple specific columns that we want to include. There are 2 required columns and then 3 optional. So of the required, you need, the first one's a title. And this is a text column that's going to contain the title of your event. And now with these columns, the header does not need to be title. It can be whatever you want. So we're going to call this activity. And that's a text column. So when we start typing, this column type will change to text. But you can also set it just by selecting something. But activity will say snorkeling. And you'll see that it updates to text because I entered text into it. So the next required field is a start date. And this can be a date or date time column. And it's going to contain the date or date time that your event begins. I'm just going to call it start date time. We can change the column type. Again, it can be date or date time. Date is simply a date. Date time contains both the date component here and then the time as well. So you can pick either. Obviously, with date time, you'll be able to select the specific start and end time. So here you can also select a date format. You have the option to select a time format. Your time zone is going to default to your document default time zone. You can also pick something different. If you ever need to update your default time zone, you can do that over here in the bottom left. You'll see settings. That takes you to document settings. And then here you can change your time zone, and that'll change it, the default for your entire document. And then you can change your currency, etc. So now that I've already set up the date time, you would just double click into it. You can select a date, and then you can enter a time. Now, those are the only 2 required columns. The next 3 are all optional. So with a start time, you'd probably want an end time. So we'll go ahead and add that. Again, this is a date or date time column, and this will contain the date or date time that the event ends. Change the column type. Again, we have date or date time. Change your formatting. And you would just enter your end date and time. Next optional column is all day. So it would be a toggle column, just look like a little checkbox to note if the event is all day long or not. And we can change that column type to toggle. And now with toggle, you do have the option of a text box, which would just be true or false. a switch where you would just switch it, or you can do the checkbox where you would just check if it's all day or leave it if it's not. And then the last column that you need for the calendar widget is type. And this is a choice or choice list column. And this would contain the event category and styling. So let's say you've got work events and personal events and maybe events for your kids all on the same calendar. You could have a type and you could say what it belongs to, whether that be work, parent 1, parent 2, whoever, whatever. We'll just call this type, make it easy. But it would be choice or choice list. Now so for the question, are these all mandatory? The only two columns that are mandatory or required to set up the calendar widget are activity and the start date time column. Those are the only two that are required. The end date time, all day, and type are all optional. And so with type, you can select choice or choice list. With choice list, it allows you to select more than one. And if you are using that, and you're trying to color code your calendar, it is only going to take the color from the first type that's listed. So just keep that in mind. And then you would just configure your different event types. So activity, and to color code it, this is how you actually color code the calendar, is by assigning a type and then each type having a color. And to add color, you just click this little box with the T. You can select a fill, you can select a text color. At the top here, you can also stylize the text. Add some bright colors here, and then just save. And then your types would all have a color, and that would allow the calendar widget to display color. Now we covered quite a few of our column types here. If you want to learn more about the various column types that are available, I'm going to share a link to our column types article. So if you want to save that and check it out later, that's just in our help center. You can also find any of these things just by typing in the search bar. Just type column types, it'll show up. Okay, so I already have all of this data entered into another table to save some time. So jumping over here, we see our text column. So that contains our title. We have our start time, end time. These are both date time columns. We have our toggle type all day, and then our type column, which assigns the type, which also assigns the color coding for the calendar. Now this table also contains various other bits of information for these different activities as well. Okay, so now that we have our data, let's add our calendar widget so we can actually view it in a more appropriate format. So to add a calendar widget, just click Add New. We want to add it to the same page, so we'll add widget to page. And then calendar is available in the list of widgets. And then you would select where your data is. So it's just in our itinerary table. That's the one where I had all the data set up ahead of time. Now, this select by appears because I have the table on the same page. And because they're the same table, I can link them. But we don't want to link the calendar to anything. We just want it to show everything. I'll add it to page. Okay, so I'm going to collapse our table of data. We don't need it. It's just what the calendar is going to be built off of. So to collapse a widget, you can click the little three dots and then collapse. You can also click and drag it into the little top. Sometimes I can't find it, but collapse. And it'll put it right up in the bar for you. And when you click on it, you can expand it full page. You can also drag it and drop it back onto the page. Okay, so we have our calendar added. We just need to configure it and map our columns. So here in the creator panel at the top, so the question is, if I want to avoid any overlap in dates, where would I put that condition? You could create like a conditional formula that just like turns this red if there's an overlap. That would probably just be the easiest to see. You could do a row conditional style. Trying to think of some other ideas. You could always add a column. In this webinar, we'll show you how to add a card that has extra details, and you could just have a little extra column that's a formula column that returns something if there is an overlap in dates. But you'll also see in the calendar if things are overlapping. So right now we see nothing in the calendar. We got to configure it. Again, that's under this calendar tab of the creator panel. So these are the 5 columns that we had initially set up. It does tell you what is optional and what is required. So start date, as we said before, is a required column. This will look for any date and date time columns in your table, and then you can select which one's just your start date. End date, again, optional. We'll look for date and date time columns. Select end date. Is all day, also, as we see, optional, and that's going to look for a toggle column. Title, that was required. Title and start date were the only 2 that were required. And that'll look for text columns. And so our title is contained in the activity column. And see, we've got it added here. We start seeing stuff, very exciting. And then the last optional column was type, and that was our choice or choice list column. And then when you assign colors to the choices, it'll colorize your calendar. And so that was contained in the type column. And so now we've got some really fun colors, and our calendar is ready to go. So there are different views in the calendar. Right now we're looking at the week view, where we can see each day of the week. You can click back to month, and this does let you click, like here it says 2 more, and so it shows me the 2 other events that are on that date. You can also jump back and just view a day, a single day. Let me click on a date that has stuff. And so here you would see the full day, and you can scroll through to see the different hours. The question, is it possible to have the widget only in read mode and not let people edit it or drag and drop elements on it? You would have to set access rules to the table itself, I believe. I hadn't done this. Yes, you would have to set the table rules for the underlying data. And he says there's one other way. I'll let her jump in. I'll let her answer that, but we'll keep going, and then I'll read her response when it pops up. Okay, so with the calendar, we saw the day, week, month view, and then as mentioned in the question, there is a way to edit and drag and drop elements within the calendar. So if you wanted to add an event, you can just double click in the calendar, and then you can add a new event. So subject, new event, yay. And you can add a start date and time. You click on it, this calendar pops up. The time is at the bottom. And then the next one is the end date and time. And then you also have this option to select if it's all day. So if I select all day, it's going to put it up here at the top. I can double click on it, edit it, and let me change the time. Okay. Oops. Did not save. and then I would put it back in the calendar. You can also change the end time and the duration of the event by clicking and dragging from the bottom, and that would change the end time and the duration. You can also click and drag from the middle of the event, and that would change the start time, but the duration would remain the same. And so the end date or the end date time would adjust accordingly. And this would all update in your underlying data table too, as you're dragging and dropping and adding things. So another thing you can do is just delete it directly from the calendar. We just double click on it and you have this option to delete. And then jumping back to that question about having the widget as read mode and not letting people edit it. If you add the widget via the custom widget menu, which I'll show you, I'll just walk through real quick to show those steps. You can change the access level. So that way you would just go add new widget to page, custom, select your data table. And then when you're configuring a custom widget here, you would just select calendar, and then you would have to change the access level to read. So that would be the way to do it. If I want my team to just only edit the filters, not the overall structure, how can I do that? So you don't want them editing the events themselves. Then I would set up the access rules. This is the best way to keep something read-only is to just add table rules for that underlying table. Just a side note, I would always recommend checking this default rules box. That'll add the access for owner so you don't have to type it in. But as the document owner, make sure you give yourself full access to the table. But then you could change everyone else to read only so that they could read the calendar but not be able to edit it. And so that's how you would keep it read only for the other users. Okay, and I'm going to share a link to our Help Center article for the calendar. It covers the different actions that we walked through. It's just a helpful resource to look back on. So I'm sharing that now. So again, you've got these 3 views, day, week, month. And it covers like how you can add an event by double clicking, how to change the start and end time, and how to delete. So again, we saw when you double click an event, it allows you to modify that start and end time, but you might have more details for your events beyond just start and end time. Specifically, like we have type, which assigns a color. We also have like notes and address and various other pieces of information about each of these events. So what we can do is add a card widget to display these details for the selected event. So under Add New, add a widget to the page. We're going to add a card widget. And then you select where your data is located, and that's the itinerary table. And then under Select By, you would select the calendar. So this first one that's listed, that's the collapsed widget I have, that's the table. And then itinerary calendar, that's what we want to select by. When we select an event in the calendar, then this card widget will update to show details. Move this around. So now when I select an event, this card updates and we can see more details about that event. And with the card widget, you can customize this view as well. In the creator panel here, under the card tab, you can change the theme, which changes the overall look of the card. And if you click this green Edit Card Layout button, you can move fields around. You can hide some fields. If you want to add something back, you can just click this Add Field at the top, and you can add fields back in. And the other thing you can do is resize. So when you hover between two boxes, just drag and you can adjust the size of them as well. Be sure to save once you make all your changes. And then I also have a link to the card and card list Help Center article that I'll share here. So if you just want to have that as a resource, that link is shared. Again, if you're in the Help Center, you can use that search bar and these things will pop up. Okay, and so we saw here how to link the card to the calendar, but linking between widgets can be done many different ways. So don't think that this is the only way you can do it. We'll walk through just another example of another way that you can link all of these things. So in the itinerary table here, I have this column trip that assigns each activity to a specific trip. And so what we can do is create a summary table grouped by this column and then link our widgets based on trip. So you don't see everything all at once, you see just the details for each trip. So I'll go ahead and create a new page. So we can add a page and then we're going to create a summary table. To create a summary table, you just click this green summation icon and that opens our group by section. And for this instance, we want to group by trip, which will group all records in the itinerary together if they share the same trip. There we go. So for Harrisburg, we had 11 records, 11 activities, hotels, transportation items. And when you create a summary table, it summarizes any numerical column. And so we had that total cost column. So it's going to summarize that. And so we can get an idea of the total cost for the trip. So next, I'd want to see my entire itinerary for each of the selected trips. So we'll add another widget to the page. This time we'll just leave it with table and we'll select itinerary and then select by that existing table, which is our summary table by trip. And so now if I select a trip, our table updates only to show those activities for that selected trip. And we saw that card view before. The card can get rid of all of these extra columns that you see in a table and just helps kind of clean up your view. So we'll add one of those and pull out these activity details into a card. So we select card under widget, again, select the data, and then select which widget you want to pick from. So itinerary by trip, that is our summary table that we first added. You can see the name up here on the left. And then itinerary is the table that shows all of the data right now. And so we want to select by that. And now when I select an activity, the card updates to show the details for that activity. And we always show this example, this linking example in our webinars because it's just a nice way to clean up this table view that has so much data. Now, because we have all of this data in the card, we can hide all of those columns Quick way to hide columns. Obviously, you can drag and right-click and hide. But if you have a bunch to hide all at once, come over here in the Creator panel under Table, and then select all, and then just deselect the ones you want to actually keep. In this case, we just want to keep activity. I want to hide the rest. And that just cleans up that view a bit. And so now I can select an event. I see all the details in the card. And then last but not least, we still would like to see all of our events in a calendar view. So let's add another widget. Select the calendar, select your data. Now under Select By, I can select by any of the 3 widgets we have. These are all the same underlying table, which means we can link them all any direction, really. We're just going to set this up so that when I select an item in my itinerary over here, both the calendar updates to show that activity, and then our card, which is already linked, will update as well. So we select itinerary and add to page. And then finally, we just need to configure our calendar. Now, I've made this mistake a bunch. I actually told Anais ahead of time in case I made the same mistake during the webinar. If you come here and you don't see data in your calendar, it's because you haven't configured it yet. So it's easy to kind of skip over that thought and just be like, where's all my stuff? Just configure it first. So start date time, end date, all day, select your title. Now it's populated, and then type. And again, just to reiterate, the only 2 required fields are title and start date. The rest are optional. And so now, let me just kind of reorganize this a bit. If I select an event in my itinerary table here, the calendar updates to select that. You'll see with this green bar that it's selected that specific activity in the calendar. And then, of course, my itinerary card updates to show the details for that one as well. And it does it across all the trips. So I can select an event and both update. So this is just another way of linking calendars and card widgets. But the possibilities are endless. You can do whatever you want, whatever makes the most sense to you and your workflow. I will share the article on linking widgets. The only linking we saw today was same record linking. These all share the same underlying data. But if you've seen our other webinars, you know that you can link using references too. But the linking widgets article that I just linked that walks through all of it. It's just a good resource for understanding linking. But that is our webinar. So if there are, I think all the questions in the chat have been answered, but if there are any more questions, please put them in the chat. And thanks for joining us today. I'm just reading through to make sure everything was answered. So this question was answered, but the question about having events with no start end time, if you don't have a start time on something, it won't show up. So for example, this New Life Lavender and Cherry Farm, I haven't added a start or end time to it. And so when I click on it, nothing happens in the calendar because it doesn't exist in the calendar view until I assign a start time. So let me do it on the 11th. And now it shows up. If I mark it as all day, it'll put it at the top. So the start time is required in order to have it appear on the calendar. Start time and title. Those are the two requirements. Thank you so much. I'm glad you enjoy the webinars. can we set a default date to load on the calendar widget? So you can do that in your underlying data table. Let me just, I'll jump to the small one to make it easy. So you could set up a trigger formula. So let me do a set trigger formula. Let's say when you add it, you want it to default to 5 days from now. So pretty sure I know this function, but I'm going to pull it up. Okay, I'm just going to share a link to this function in the chat rather than like with the pop-up. But there's this date add function, which I'll walk through here. You can find this in our function reference guide, again in the Help Center. Very useful. Okay, so with date add, you can create a date that's ahead of some start date. So the function, oops, typing in the wrong spot. Okay, function is date add. And when you start typing in a formula, it does give suggestions. So here's date add. You need a start date, and then you need the number of days, months, years, weeks, etc. Past that date. If you want dates prior to that, just use negatives. But that's the function we're going to use. The start date we'll say is today, which is itself a function, all capitalized, open, close parentheses. And then let's say we want 5 days in the future. So we do days equal 5, close, and we're going to apply it to new records. And so when I create a new record, that date, one issue I did, because this is a date time column, you could use the function now, and this is going to be a little bit confusing. Now, let me just capital NOW, open close parentheses. That is the date time function, meaning it carries a time component with it. So if you wanted to set it 5 days in the future at the exact current time, you would use now. So let me show that as the example instead. Today would have 5 days in the future, but because it doesn't carry the time component, it would put it at midnight. So just keep that in mind. We'll use now, and then it'll just carry my time. Okay, activity, we'll call it Grist, oops, okay, Grist webinar. Okay, so it does just carry midnight regardless if you use now or today. So it doesn't, this little bit here doesn't matter. Today or now works. But it'll put it 5 days in the future. And so now I create an activity, it automatically assigns that start time. You can still change it however you want. So feel free to modify that. Then at least it would appear on your calendar, and then you'd be able to drag and drop it. And then end date and time, if you wanted to do another trigger formula, that's, you could use a very similar function. You could just set it to the same date if you wanted. So you can keep that in mind. If you wanted to make things that need to be scheduled a different color, to be scheduled, we're going to add a new item, and we could just make this red. And then again, we're going to do another trigger formula. So when a record is created, we could, oops, I think that's what I put. When you want something to be equal to text, just use the quotations. That just ensures it's a string. And you could default it. So let me create a new example. And now it's automatically going to assign that type. So if I create a calendar, set up this calendar for look at 1031. It's way up at the top. We see this red box now that shows us that this item needs to be scheduled. If you wanted it to just appear in all day, we could default all day to be true. And so that when the item is created, let me show an example of this. So we're just going to set this to true. Again, to set something to a string, just use the quotations. And then now it puts it in red, but at the very top. So some different ideas for you that would help make it stand out a bit. Awesome. Any other questions? For those who might be curious about next month's webinar, we're continuing our webinars on views. And so next month, we're going to talk about charts and summary tables, and we'll look at the dynamic linking, which we saw a little bit of dynamic linking today, but with the charts, it's really cool. Is it possible to BI dashboard with it? I do not know. I'm not familiar with BI dashboards. Anais, would you know? That might be a really good question for the community. If other users do stuff with it, they can help give you details about like what they do. I'll share a link to that. I know you're on the community already, but sharing the link again for those who need it. Awesome. Any other questions? If not, thanks again for joining us, you guys. It's been a pleasure as always, and definitely join us for next month's webinar.